You probably didn't notice it when it happened. There was no emergency summit on television. No breaking news banner crawling across the bottom of your screen. No dramatic speeches about the end of an era. But quietly, over the course of a few months, something shifted in the global balance of power. Western leaders had spent decades assuming one thing was always true, that no matter how big China grew, no matter how fast its economy expanded, no matter how many factories it built or ports it financed, the West still held the real leverage. The financial system, the trade routes, the military alliances, the ability to apply pressure when it mattered. Then one day, China proved that assumption wrong, not with missiles, not with troops, not with warships in the South China Sea, but with economics. To understand why this moment shocked so many governments, you have to rewind just a little. In the early 2000s, China was still seen as the world's factory. It made cheap goods, exported them to the West, and recycled the profits back into used treasury bonds. The system worked like a loop. Americans bought Chinese products. China bought American debt. Everyone benefited. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy. By 2020, it dominated global manufacturing in sectors ranging from electronics to pharmaceuticals to renewable energy components. By the mid-2020s, it controlled more than 60% of global rare earth mineral processing, the materials essential for smartphones, electric vehicles, and modern weapon systems. For years, Western policymakers talked about this dependence as a risk, but nothing really changed. It was cheaper to keep buying from China, easier to keep supply chains where they were, more profitable to pretend diversification could happen later. Later just never came. Then trade tensions escalated. Tariffs were imposed. Sanctions expanded. Technology restrictions tightened. The West believed it was finally pushing back. China didn't respond the way most people expected. Instead of lashing out with dramatic retaliation, Beijing waited. And while everyone focused on tariffs and speeches, China kept doing something else. It kept securing resources. It kept signing infrastructure deals. It kept expanding payment systems, shipping routes, and long-term supply contracts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By the time the pressure campaigns peaked, China wasn't just a manufacturing hub anymore. It had become the central node of a massive global economic network. More than 140 countries were now tied into Chinese trade and investment flows through major projects and long-term agreements. In many developing economies, China had become the largest trading partner, surpassing both the United States and the European Union. Entire ports were built with Chinese financing. Railways that connected landlocked regions to the sea were operated by Chinese firms. Power plants, industrial zones, and logistics hubs increasingly ran on Chinese capital and technology. On paper, it looked like development. In reality, it was influence. And then came the moment that made Western governments realize just how much leverage China had accumulated. It started with something small, a dispute over technology exports. Restrictions placed on Chinese access to advanced semiconductor equipment. The West expected Beijing to negotiate. Instead, China adjusted a handful of export rules of its own. Certain minerals, certain processed materials, nothing dramatic. Just tighter licensing requirements, longer approval timelines, new regulatory reviews. At first, markets barely reacted. Then manufacturers started calling suppliers. And suddenly, production delays appeared across multiple industries at once. Electric vehicle companies couldn't source key battery components. Defense contractors faced shortages of specialty alloys. Electronics firms warned of supply bottlenecks for critical parts. Within weeks, prices began rising. Within months, factory output slowed in several Western economies. What shocked policymakers wasn't that China had resources. It was how concentrated control had become. In some materials, China didn't just produce more than anyone else. It processed nearly everything. Even when minerals were mined in Africa or South America, they were often shipped to China for refining before being sent to the rest of the world. That meant Beijing didn't need to ban exports entirely. It just had to slow them. And slowing was enough. The West had spent decades building just-in-time supply chains optimized for cost, not resilience. There were no stockpiles large enough to replace months of disrupted flows. No alternative processing capacity ready to scale overnight. Every week of delay rippled through global production. Factories paused shifts. Companies revised earnings forecasts. Governments quietly scrambled to find emergency suppliers that didn't exist yet. And that's when the message became clear. China didn't have to threaten with force. It had already built a form of economic leverage so deep, so embedded in global trade, that even minor adjustments created real pain. This wasn't an embargo. It wasn't a blockade. It was structural power. For the first time, Western leaders confronted a reality they had long avoided. The world economy had reorganized itself around China faster than institutions could adapt. Supply chains weren't just global anymore. They were centered. Centered on Chinese processing, Chinese logistics, Chinese financing, and Chinese industrial scale. And when that center shifted its policies, the effects traveled everywhere. What made this moment so unsettling wasn't just the economic disruption. It was the speed. In less than 20 years, China had gone from a low-cost exporter to the backbone of critical global production systems. In less than a generation, it had positioned itself at the choke points of modern industry. Rare earths, batteries, solar components, advanced manufacturing inputs, strategic infrastructure, all quietly consolidated, all now essential. The West had assumed power came from military alliances and financial dominance. China showed that in the 21st century, power also comes from controlling the physical systems the world runs on. And once those systems are built, influence becomes automatic. No speech is required. No threats needed. Just leverage. By the time officials publicly acknowledged what was happening, the damage was already spreading across markets. Investors began pricing in long-term supply risks. Governments launched emergency reshoring initiatives that would take years to materialize. The realization was uncomfortable. China hadn't confronted the West head-on. It had outgrown it in the infrastructure of the global economy. And the world was only beginning to understand what that meant. Because this wasn't a one-time pressure point. It was the first demonstration of a new kind of power. One built not on conquest, but on dependency. And once dependency is in place, influence becomes permanent. The question now wasn't whether China could pressure the West. It was how often it would choose to do so. And what would happen when the stakes became truly political? Because if small regulatory shifts could slow global industries, imagine what larger strategic moves could do. The day China quietly proved this leverage wasn't loud. But it changed how power works in the modern world. At first, Western officials framed the disruptions as temporary. Supply chains always wobbled, they said. Markets would adjust. New suppliers would emerge. Production would normalize. But normalization never really came. Because what China had built wasn't just a collection of factories. It was an ecosystem. Take rare earth elements as an example. These aren't actually rare in nature. They exist in many countries across the world. The problem is processing them is expensive, environmentally messy, and technologically complex. For decades, Western nations outsourced that work to China because it was cheaper and faster. Over time, nearly all large-scale refining capacity moved there. So even when Australia mined rare earths, even when Africa extracted them, even when new reserves were discovered elsewhere, the raw materials still flowed back to Chinese processing plants. The world didn't just depend on China for supply. It depended on China for transformation. And transformation is where real control lives. The same pattern appeared in batteries. Lithium might be mined in South America. Cobalt might come from Central Africa. Nickel might originate in Southeast Asia. But the refining, the cell manufacturing, and the large-scale assembly overwhelmingly happen in China. By the mid-2020s, Chinese companies dominate nearly every stage of the battery supply chain, which meant that as electric vehicles exploded in popularity across Europe and North America, The clean energy transition itself quietly ran through Beijing. The West hadn't just outsourced production. It had outsourced the future. And once that reality set in, governments realized how deep the vulnerability ran. It wasn't only about a few minerals or components. Telecommunications equipment, solar panels, industrial machinery, medical supplies, consumer electronics, shipping containers, port cranes. Across sector after sector, China wasn't just a participant. It was the central supplier. During the years of rapid globalization, this concentration felt efficient. During geopolitical tension, it felt dangerous. What made the situation even more complicated was how quickly alternatives would take to build. Constructing new processing plants for rare earths can take a decade. Scaling battery manufacturing requires massive capital investment and specialized expertise. Relocating complex supply chains isn't like moving a factory. It involves thousands of suppliers, logistics routes, regulatory approvals, and skilled labor pools. In other words, even if the West started diversifying immediately, real independence would take years, possibly decades. China knew this. That's why its response to pressure was so measured. No dramatic cutoffs, no sudden embargoes, just carefully calibrated friction. Enough to remind the world who sat at the center of the system. And while policymakers focused on supply vulnerabilities, something else was happening quietly in the background. China's trade relationships were shifting. For much of the late 20th century, the United States and Europe had been China's main customers. By the 2020s, that balance had changed. China had become the largest trading partner for most of Asia, Africa, and large parts of Latin America. Its exports increasingly flowed south and east, not just west. Its imports of raw materials, food, and energy came from a growing network of emerging economies. This diversification meant that Western markets, while still important, were no longer dominant. China had built a global customer base, which reduced the impact of Western pressure. At the same time, Chinese financial institutions were expanding their role in development lending. Infrastructure projects weren't just roads and railways. They were long-term economic linkages. Countries that relied on Chinese financing often used Chinese equipment, Chinese contractors, and Chinese supply chains. Trade naturally followed. Over time, regional economies became more intertwined with China than with the West, not through ideology, through economics. This shift mattered because influence follows dependency. When your ports are financed by Chinese banks, when your railways are operated by Chinese firms, when your power grids rely on Chinese equipment, decisions start carrying geopolitical weight, not because of threats, because of incentives. No government wants to jeopardize the infrastructure its economy depends on. The West had long assumed that global trade would naturally align countries around Western norms and systems. China showed a different model, one based on building the physical foundations of growth first, and letting political alignment follow later. By the time the first supply chain shock hit Western industries, much of the world was already economically orbiting China, which meant the leverage wasn't just bilateral. It risked disrupting large portions of the global economy at once. And that reality began to change how Western governments behaved. Suddenly, policy debates included phrases like strategic autonomy, economic security, and supply chain resilience. Suddenly, industrial policy returned after decades of free market dominance. Suddenly, subsidies poured into domestic manufacturing projects that would have been unthinkable years earlier, because China wasn't standing still. Even as diversification efforts began, Beijing continued investing heavily in advanced manufacturing, automation, artificial intelligence, and next-generation energy technologies. Higher value production, more complex systems, greater integration across industries. The deeper China embedded itself in critical technologies, the harder disentanglement would become, which meant every year of delay increased dependence, and every increase in dependence expanded leverage. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of long-term industrial strategy, decades of targeted investment, carefully chosen sectors, relentless scaling. While much of the West prioritized short-term profits and financial efficiency, China prioritized capacity and control. Two different economic philosophies. One built for quarterly returns, the other built for strategic dominance. And now the consequences of that difference were becoming visible. The West wasn't facing a sudden crisis. It was confronting the outcome of choices made over 40 years. Outsourcing, cost-cutting, efficiency above resilience. China had simply played the long game. And the leverage demonstration was only the beginning. Because supply chains were just one layer of a much larger shift underway. As the economic pressure rippled outward, something subtle began changing in international politics. Countries that once automatically aligned with Western positions started hesitating. Votes at global institutions became less predictable. Statements grew more neutral. Diplomatic language softened. It wasn't that nations were suddenly choosing China ideologically. They were responding to reality. When your largest trading partner builds your ports, finances your highways, buys your commodities, and supplies your factories, confrontation becomes expensive. Not in theory, in jobs, in growth, in political stability. For decades, the West had relied on economic influence to shape global behavior. Access to markets, financial systems, investment flows. Now China was offering an alternative center of gravity. And for many countries, that alternative felt tangible. Western influence had often come with conditions. Governance reforms, regulatory changes, political expectations, long negotiations. Chinese investment arrived faster, with fewer public demands. An immediate infrastructure. Roads that connected farmers to markets. Ports that enabled exports. Power plants that stabilized electricity. Growth people could see. This didn't mean Chinese projects were perfect. Many came with debt risks. Some struggled financially. Others sparked local backlash. But in dozens of countries, they still transformed economic possibilities. And that mattered. When trade disputes between China and the West intensified, many governments quietly calculated the cost of choosing sides. And increasingly, neutrality won. Not because of loyalty, because of economics. This was the second layer of leverage. The first was supply chains. The second was global alignment. China's economic network didn't just produce goods. It reshaped incentives. Meanwhile, Western policymakers faced an uncomfortable contradiction. They wanted to reduce dependence on China, but their own corporations were deeply invested there. China wasn't just a supplier. It was a market of over 1 billion consumers. For many multinational firms, profits from China represented a massive share of global revenue. Leaving wasn't just costly, it was potentially devastating. So while governments talked about strategic decoupling, businesses quietly lobbied for stability. They needed Chinese factories. They needed Chinese consumers. They needed Chinese logistics, which created a political balancing act. Push too hard and domestic companies would suffer. Pull back and dependence would deepen. China understood this tension well, and it used predictability as a tool. Where Western policy often shifted with elections and public pressure, Chinese strategy moved steadily. Long-term plans, consistent investment, clear industrial goals. This stability made China attractive as an economic partner. Firms could plan decades ahead. Supply chains could scale without constant regulatory uncertainty. In a volatile global economy, predictability became a competitive advantage. Slowly, quietly, capital followed. Factories expanded in China instead of relocating. Research centers opened near Chinese manufacturing hubs. Innovation ecosystems clustered where production already existed. The deeper these systems intertwined, the harder separation became, which reinforced China's central position. This is how economic gravity works. Once enough mass accumulates, everything nearby starts orbiting. The West was discovering that gravity doesn't disappear just because you wish it would. At the same time, China accelerated investments in technologies that would define the next era of growth: artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, high-speed rail, renewable energy manufacturing, semiconductors, electric vehicles. Not just assembling products, designing them, improving them, scaling them faster than competitors could. The goal wasn't merely participation, it was leadership. And in several sectors, China began pulling ahead. Solar panel production became overwhelmingly Chinese. Battery costs fell fastest where Chinese firms dominated. Electric vehicle adoption surged where manufacturing was closest. Supply chains reinforced innovation. Innovation reinforced supply chains, a feedback loop of growth. The West suddenly faced a new problem. Even if it rebuilt domestic manufacturing, China was already moving up the value ladder. Catching up would require massive investment, years of development, and coordinated industrial strategy across fragmented political systems. Meanwhile, China could act quickly. By the time Western governments fully grasped what had happened, the shift was already embedded in the structure of the global economy. China hadn't seized territory. It hadn't imposed ideology. It hadn't fired a single shot. Instead, it had positioned itself at the crossroads of modern life. Energy systems, transportation networks, digital infrastructure, manufacturing chains, critical resources, the invisible architecture that keeps economies running. And once you control the architecture, influence flows naturally. What made this moment different from past power transitions was how quiet it was. Empires used to rise through conquest, through colonization, through wars that redrew maps. China's rise happened through contracts, supply agreements, financing deals, and industrial capacity. It unfolded in spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and infrastructure blueprints. While headlines focused on tariffs and diplomatic spats, the real transformation was happening underneath, layer by layer, connection by connection, until suddenly the world realized how much depended on one central hub. This is why the day China applied economic pressure wasn't dramatic. There was no single announcement, no countdown, no crisis meeting broadcast live. Yet the impact rippled faster than many military actions ever could. Factories slowed, markets adjusted, governments recalculated, all from modest regulatory changes. That was the moment the West understood something fundamental had changed. Power in the 21st century wasn't just about who had the strongest army. It was about who sat at the center of production, logistics, and technological ecosystems. Who could influence global flows with small policy shifts? Who had built dependence so deep it couldn't be undone quickly? China had done exactly that. And it had done it faster than any major power in modern history. In roughly 40 years, it moved from a largely rural economy to the backbone of global manufacturing. In less than a generation, it became the largest trading partner for most of the world. In just 2 decades, it built industrial capacity that took Western nations a century to develop, years of investment, decades of capacity building. And during that transition, dependence remains, which means leverage remains too. The West is now racing to rebuild resilience while operating within systems China helped design. It's attempting to reduce reliance on an economy that has become deeply integrated into global life. And that's far harder than never becoming dependent in the first place. Meanwhile, China continues moving forward, expanding into advanced technology, strengthening regional trade networks, deepening infrastructure ties, climbing higher up the value chain. This is why the moment China applied quiet pressure mattered so much, not because of the short-term disruption, but because it revealed a new balance of power. One built not on fear of force, but on fear of disruption, on the realization that modern economies are fragile webs, and whoever anchors the web holds enormous influence. The world is now entering an era where economic interdependence shapes geopolitics more than ever before, where supply chains can carry as much strategic weight as military bases, where infrastructure determines alignment, where production capacity becomes national security. China understood this early, invested accordingly, and the results are now visible across the globe. The question moving forward isn't whether China will remain a major power. That's already settled. The real question is how the world adapts to a system where influence is distributed through economic networks rather than enforced through dominance. Whether countries can build resilience without fragmenting global cooperation. Whether competition can coexist with interdependence. And whether rising powers and established ones can navigate this shift without repeating the conflicts of the past. History tells us moments like this are dangerous. When old systems fade and new ones emerge. When power balances adjust faster than institutions. When uncertainty fills the gaps. But history also shows that outcomes aren't predetermined. Transitions can lead to conflict, or they can lead to new forms of cooperation. What makes this era unique is how much of the struggle will happen through economics rather than armies, through trade flows rather than troop movements, through infrastructure rather than invasion. The day China quietly demonstrated its leverage wasn't the start of a confrontation. It was the unveiling of a new global reality, one where influence is earned through building the systems the world depends on, and where power belongs to those who understand how deeply modern life is interconnected. Whether this leads to rivalry, balance, or collaboration will shape the rest of the century. But one thing is already clear. The age where the West sat alone at the center of the global economy is over. A multipolar economic world has arrived, and China is one of its core pillars. If we manage this transition wisely, it could bring shared growth and stability. If we mismanage it, the pressures of speed, scale, and uncertainty could push nations into conflict none of them want. The future isn't written yet, but the systems shaping it are already in place. And understanding how power now flows through those systems may be the most important challenge of our time.